Hello. In this video, I thought it'd be interesting to go through characters I have kept throughout the 10 years of me playing Path of Exile. While I was a casual gamer for my first 5 years of Path of Exile, with only playing 1 to 2 characters per year to 90 plus, since Delve League, I have averaged around 3 to 4 characters to 95 plus, and more recently level 100 on all characters, with a mix of characters that were just straight up 5-way carried, or the tried and true just blasting maps like Chris wants. Thus, I've played roughly 50 to 60 distinctly different builds in total, since I don't like recreating builds over and over. Thus, the 11 builds that I will showcase are what I believe to be the top 20% of builds that I've played. I will show some gameplay of each of these tunes, but since I will typically update these characters in Standard League with new items or new crafting methods or update them to new Atlas passive trees, you can find their 321 POBs in the description. Also, I'm not trying to flex on anyone, as you would expect many of these characters to be worth multiple mirrors given the amount of time that I've played PoE, but just like mostly everyone else that has played this game, in the first few years of me playing Path of Exile, I would typically get a character to roughly the 20 to 40 divine in value mark, and then quit them and change to a new character. And as you progress and get more experienced, this level of investment keeps increasing as your knowledge of the game increases, thus you get richer and richer. So instead of stopping at 20 to 40 divine characters, I then would push to 100 divine, and or then I would push to half a mirror, and now I typically will stop a character when they're roughly at mirror in cost. And if I especially like the character, I will typically invest 1 to 2 mirrors into them, with usually having a mirror weapon, mage blood, and some other expensive uniques. The first character that I would like to showcase is my Vaal Ground Slam build. This build was made possible because of the release of Hateforge, and also in recent patches has gone insanely strong due to the release of Mage Blood, Original Sin, and now the Crucible passives on Brutus Lead Sprinkler. Thus, this character has double the DPS of any of my other characters, and also has insanely large AoE. So if I'm looking to do Uber bosses or 100% Delirium content that has tanky mods, this is my go-to character. The next character is my Discharge build that I created in Crucible League. While it is semi-similar to my Ground Slam build, as it has insanely high single hit damage, with my discharges doing over 50 million damage per hit, and also has insanely big AoE, just like Vaal Ground Slam. Where it differs is the movement speed of my discharge build is actually very quick because of my investment into Lightning Warp, as it basically doesn't have a cast time. But also, unlike Vaal Ground Slam, where I tried to get pretty much the highest damage that I could to one-shot anything in the game, including bosses, my Discharge build is a more well-rounded build and a lot more tanky. Thus, I believe my Discharge build is my best overall character that can do any content in the entire game. But specifically, I would play this character if I'm looking to do a lot of 100% Delirium maps. The next character that I have is my Spectral Shield Throw build, which was also created in Crucible League. This build is also strong at doing 100% Delirium map content, and I would specifically play this character over my Discharge build if I was looking to do a map that had a ton of offensive modifiers. As my Spectral Shield Throw build, while it does a bit less damage than my Discharge build and has less clear speed, it is way more tanky, as it is probably twice as tanky as any other character that I have. Thus, if I'm looking to do any invitation bosses that have really bad modifiers, or Delirium maps that have really bad modifiers, Spectral Shield Throw would be my go-to build to play. My next character is my Righteous Fire build, which uses 3 6 links in Scorching Ray, Righteous Fire, and Flame Wall. Now, while the footage is a more well-rounded build, I have since changed this build pretty substantially into basically the fastest Alpha-Go mapping character that I have, as I reduced a lot of its tankiness and damage and invested just into movement speed and AoE. So if I'm looking to do easier content and still want a fairly tanky build that just runs around and is extremely smooth, Righteous Fire is my go-to character for this content. And similar to my Righteous Fire build, I also have a Shockwave Cyclone build, which has a similar playstyle, which is just spinning or running around and clearing content extremely smoothly and quickly. But unlike my Righteous Fire build, this is a more well-rounded build, as it doesn't lack the damage to do bosses if I felt like doing them, whereas with all the investment of movement speed into my Righteous Fire build, even less tanky bosses like Minotaur won't go down within seconds, whereas Cyclone Shockwave still packs a heavy punch. My next build is my Snipe Puncture build, which was the character that I first created to do Uber bosses, and specifically Uber bosses, as this build excels in the amount of tankiness it has, but also it has a decent amount of investment into life regen to combat a lot of the degen puddles in Uber boss fights. Additionally, if they release any new bosses that require a lot of movement, this build is also exceptional with the amount of movement speed that it has due to Mage Blood, but also the consistency that bleeds do, as once I put up a puncture bleed on the target, I can run around and basically do nothing for 20 seconds as the target slowly bleeds out. So if I were to do specifically bossing content in which I couldn't one-shot with my Vaal Groundslam character, Snipe Puncture would be my next choice. The next build that I have is my Manaforged Widowhail build, and while this build isn't necessarily exceptional, it kind of holds a close place to my heart, as when I created this build, the community built upon my original idea and created a lot of Manaforged builds after it, but nevertheless, it is still a strong character and can easily do a lot of the non-Uber content within seconds, but I wouldn't say it is an extremely strong character versus Uber content due to the average tankiness that it has. My next character goes back to a similar build as the Puncture Bleed bow that I have, and that is Bleed Bladestorm. And they're pretty much identical with a few differences in that my Bleed Bladestorm build does a bit more damage, but is a little bit less tank. But the major downside is that my Bladestorm build is melee, and if you're doing any hard bossing content, being melee is definitely a detriment. So while I still do have this character, and I enjoy the playstyle of the character, it is one of my weaker characters, but hopefully GGG in the future buffs Bleed and or buffs melee, or buffs a variety of different things that would make this build stronger.
We will win this together.
Annihilation. The hatchling surprises.
My next build is my Exsanguinate character, which now we're getting into builds that are a little bit less meta than the current meta, as I made this build several leagues ago, and GGG has not given a lot of tools to scale Exsanguinate as a dot as much as it has given tools to elemental hit builds, for example. So while this build is extremely smooth when it comes to map clearing, as the amount of targets Exsanguinate can hit due to its ult quality and link to Unleash, it does have a little bit of a damage hindrance, as Alpha-Go maps are fine, and or, as you can see, 60% Delirium is fine. but once you get to tankier targets like 100% Delirium and or bosses, this build falls short even though it has all the other things that you would want from a good build. The next character that I have is my Caustic Arrow build, and this is pretty similar to my Righteous Fire build, as it is specifically created to do Alkengo maps as smooth and fast as possible. And while my Caustic Arrow build has roughly half the damage as my Righteous Fire build, it has roughly twice as much AoE as my Righteous Fire build, since Caustic Arrow is extremely good if you link it to Arrow Nova, as it basically covers your entire screen. But also, this is one of my cheaper builds, along with Exsanguinate, as it only costs half a mirror, with pretty much the entire cost of the build going into Mage Blood and a decent weapon for this build. And again, the damage is not as high as other builds, as archetypes like damage over time have consistently underperformed in recent history due to the lack of investment that you can make into damage. And lastly, my Magic Vine Tornado Shot character. And this is different from any other build that I have, as it's specifically made for currency generation. So while Tornado Shot is a pretty smooth playstyle, as you can just basically click anywhere on the screen and your entire screen will be covered in arrows and everything will die, I don't believe this build to be exceptional in any way, as it has good damage, but not insane damage, and it is tanky enough, but not super tanky. So this build is more vanilla than my other builds, at least in terms of what I believe to be enjoyable from a build. But I keep this character around because it is, again, Magic Vine. So if I'm looking to farm a bunch of currency, and or if they ever bring back loot goblins that scale off of rarity, and or if they release additional unique items that I'm looking to farm immediately, my Magic Vine character would be my go-to pick to farm new content. So, those are my 11 characters out of the 50 or 60 so that I've played over the past 10 years. If you have any comments or questions, and or if you want to talk about your favorite builds, put them in the comments, and I will read them and get to them. And thanks for watching.